I'd like to introduce Paul before he begins talking. Paul Hirsch is a member of the Institute for Historical Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, go Longhorns, and he's a current resident of Washington, D.C. And he has a PhD in history from UC Santa Barbara, where, like me, he specialized in diplomatic history. And he works on the relationships between culture, diplomacy, and race. And his work has received a number of awards, including the American Historical Association's Jackson Award for Best First Article, and generous funding from, among others, the Science Foundation, the Library of Congress, and the Robert B. Silvers Foundation. And most recently, he's the author of Pulp Empire, which you're going to get to see in a second, The Secret History of Comic Book Imperialism. And it's a truly wonderful book published by the University of Chicago Press last year. And I'll just give a quick plug for it. It's one of the most remarkably illustrated academic books I've ever seen. Beautiful, full color comic pages. And not only that, it's like $35. So I have no idea how he pulled off that miracle. And the book is just fantastic. It's racking up awards. Book of the Year from the Popular Cultural Association, honorable mention, Book of the Year from the Society for Historians of U.S. Foreign Relations. And it's even been nominated for an Eisner Award for Best Scholarly Work on Comics, which, if you don't know, that's kind of like the Golden Globes. It's like the Oscars for comics folks. And I want to just say briefly that I invited Paul to provide this keynote because Pulp Empire captures so much of these ideas that are going to be central to this conference. Comics are a powerful cultural force for reflecting and shaping attitudes around U.S. foreign policy. And Paul's going to talk about the fact that the U.S. government recognized this early on, using the semi-official Writers' War Board to directly shape comic narratives in support of the U.S. effort in World War II. And as arguably the most widely read media of the era, comics allowed the government to reinforce positive narratives about expanding U.S. power while demonizing Nazi enemies and enhancing racial animosity towards Japan. And even when the government demobilized not only its GIs, but also this cultural influence in comics, these still act as ambassadors for the United States. These four-color ambassadors that were still circulating around the world, shaping the way that people view the United States, and sometimes making our policymakers very anxious about what they said about race, about what they said about crime and other things in the United States. And so comics continued to elicit often virulent government reaction, which led directly to the creation, as many of you might know, of the comics codes that encourage comics to adhere to domestic and international ideas of an idealized American Cold War society, at least for a little while. And so these are very much the stories about why comics are so important, both internationally and domestically. And they carefully crafted these cultural mores that help kind of reinforce some of the narratives of the United States during the Cold War. So we'll discuss a lot of these ideas tomorrow, but I want to begin the conversation tonight. So please feel free to type in any questions you might have to the chat. We'll keep an eye on that, and we can pose some to Paul at the end. We'll also be recording this, so if you have to duck out or if you think anyone you know might be interested, we'll have that posted to the Mershon Center's YouTube channel at some point in the future. And just a final note, we are having some internet difficulties here at Ohio State broadly. A number of our websites are down, including the one, unfortunately, that has the schedule for the conference tomorrow. So the conference itself is going to start at 10 a.m. Hopefully you all have already signed up for it and you have the links, so you'll be able to still get there. Zoom seems to be working just fine. But the conference begins at 10 a.m. and then we'll pick up with the second panel, I believe, at 2 p.m. So we'd love to see some of you guys there for that. But right now, I'm very excited to hand the conversation over to Paul Hirsch, author of Pulp Empire. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, Joe, for the intro. I'm so happy to be here. I want to thank you, Joe, Jenny as well, for all the work that you put into this, all of the other departments that made this possible. I will get into more detail about why I'm so excited to be here, but suffice to say for a beginning, thank you. And I really am grateful. We at this conference are all members of a small but growing discipline. And it's just vital that we get to meet and speak with each other and correspond. And this is the first conference that I've participated in that's wholly about comics and also about accompanying documents. I've certainly participated in conferences before that analyze comic book content or talk about issue 278 of Batman, but I've never really been at a conference that's as comprehensive as this one and that approaches the topic as seriously as this one. And that means a lot to me personally because, I spent the last 10 years writing a dissertation and a book. And for, a good chunk of that time, I was met with smirks or, kind of raised eyebrows when I talked about what I was doing, pardon my cat's tail. And it's really wonderful to know that we're through that this is a topic that is taken seriously. This is a topic that is being combined with archival research, and that we have such a great turnout for this conference. So I am personally almost overwhelmed with happiness that this is taking place. I know it makes me feel like I am out of the wilderness, and I'm just excited to get the chance to meet all of you and to sort of talk about the state of the discipline and to discuss what's left to be done, because there is so much left to be done. And when Joe invited me to this conference, the first thing I thought of was a conference held back in 1948. A sociologist at NYU named Harvey Zorbaugh convened a conference there. He was a sociologist. He called other sociologists. He invited a couple of people from outside NYU, including the legendary and notorious Dr. Frederick Wortham, to come to this conference. And as far as I can tell from my research, this was the first conference convened on comic books. And it was a bit of a disaster, at least from reading Wortham's letters back and forth with Professor Zorbaugh. There was a huge disagreement between people on faculty who felt that comics were both useful and fairly benign, and then people like Wortham, who basically came to the conference to harangue the participants. So I am thinking of this conference as the mirror image of that one. This is the rehabilitation of comics and US foreign relations. This is confirmation that what we're studying is serious and important and has very real applications to what's going on in the world today, particularly in terms of US cultural and military diplomacy. And I'm thrilled that we're able to sort of found our own little tradition here based on refuting what happened in 1948. I think we're going to look back at this conference as a spark, as a remarkable beginning of things to come. And I want to emphasize before I start, and I will talk about this again towards the end of the conference, that for a long time, working on comics as a adjunct to diplomatic history was fairly lonely. It was difficult to find mentors because it's such a new field. It was difficult to find people who understood the significance of the comic book medium and who understood the importance of supporting documents and evidence and oral histories. And so for a long time, the fields that received my work most hospitably were racial studies, American studies, and cultural studies. And for years, those are the conferences I went to, those are the journals I published in. And I was always sad that I felt a little siloed, separated from my colleagues in the field of US foreign relations. And I want everyone here to know that those days are over. You have mentors available to you now. You have resources available to you now. You can always contact me. You have Joe, you have Jenny, you have the wonderful Richie Graham at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. You have Georgia Higley at the Library of Congress, who was absolutely instrumental in getting my book finished, and any number of other people. And I can't speak for anyone else involved in this conference, but I will tell you that if you have any crisis of confidence, any questions, if you want to talk anything out, I am here. It's vital that we support each other. This is, a nascent, growing discipline. And my hope is that in 2 or 3 years, there will be enough books and articles out there that all of us can start teaching courses on World War II and the Cold War in comics, US foreign relations and comics. That's really my dream. when I started this project, I hope some of you can relate to this. I went to the National Archives in College Park and for some reason had this idea in my head that there was going to be a box there marked the US government's secret relationship to the comic book industry, 1940 to 1970. And not only was there no such box, but there were no archivists who were familiar with the comic book holdings at the National Archives. What happened to me was that I had a panic attack and ran out of the National Archives and spent about an hour and a half in the parking lot doing deep breathing exercises and meditation before I went in. And I just want to reiterate that none of you have to feel that way. We are all in this together, and it's really exciting. I personally don't want anyone at this conference or anyone listening to start their research with a panic attack. I want you to be excited, and I want you to be aware of the resources that are out there. And you will need support, and you will need boosting from those of us at this conference, because after spending approximately 5 or 6 years in probably a dozen archives in the US and Europe, I can tell you that there is no secret box. The records of comic book, the comic book's relationship with the federal government and the governments of England and France and others are hidden. And they're hidden for a number of reasons. The first is there was never any official comic book agency at any of these organizations. The second is that a lot of propagandists in the US federal government were inordinately embarrassed that they were using comic books. They thought this was below them. They thought this was crass, low, vicious culture. And so they went out of their way never to talk about comic books in the documents that they preserved. You will find euphemisms like the cartoon technique or sequential artwork, but you will almost never find a reference to comic books. So that alone complicates this research. And then knowing that perhaps a dozen federal agencies during World War II and the Cold War made some use of comic books makes this even more daunting, because you have to go through 1,000 boxes for each agency. That's just the way it is. So again, I understand I'm belaboring this, but you have to understand how exciting it is for me to be presenting this to you. Do not feel that you're alone. We are all in this together. And with that, I'm going to segue into the core of my talk, which is about two major topics. The first is the relationship between the federal government and the comic book industry at mid-20th century. And the second is the absolute inseparability of race from the topic of cooperation between the federal government and the comic book industry. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the way comic books are printed, but they use 4 inks, 4 colors, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And in the same way that a comic book image would be incomplete without any one of those colors, to understand comics and diplomacy requires us to have a very broad lens. We have to look at race relations within the United States, as well as America's efforts to win the hearts and minds of people of color in the decolonizing world. We have to look at the history and structure of capitalism at mid-20th century. We have to look at America's military priorities at mid-20th century. All of these, oh, and of course, American domestic politics. To remove any of these is to obscure the true image of the significance of comics to US foreign relations. And I would encourage all of you to keep the absolute most open mind you can about incorporating other disciplines into your study of comic books. And I'm well aware that interdisciplinary has become a bit of an eye roller, but we all have to be interdisciplinary scholars. There is no way to tackle this topic without the help of gender scholars, without the help of racial scholars, without the help of scholars of capitalism and Marxism, without the help of US foreign relations specialists. So please bear that in mind as I talk and as you're doing your own research, that the two cores of my book are not really separable from the peripheral histories that inform them. And I think that's true for all of us who are doing work with comics. And I understand that most of you are already specialists, but for those of you who are not, I'm going to give a very brief overview of comics at mid-20th century so that we understand what we're talking about and why the industry's involvement with the government is so important. When we think of comics now, the form itself has absolutely been overwhelmed by comic book films. The significance of comics as paper objects is essentially nil. People happily read graphic novels and they appear on the Times bestseller list and things like that. But individual comic books, superhero comics, they are not what they once were. And I need you to cast your mind back with me to the mid-1930s when the comic book industry began, because it almost overnight turned into a cultural colossus. It's difficult to overstate the pervasiveness of comic books in the United States and around the world in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. We are talking about a wildly popular medium. And that goes for commercial comics as well as propaganda comics published by the United States government by the hundreds of millions during mid-20th century. And one of the things that's so unique about comics to me and that makes it so valuable as an optic on the past is that it's a cultural form that not only reached millions of people at home, as well as across the global South, but also gave voice to many marginalized groups of Americans. The comic book industry at its inception and through the mid-20th century was, as one artist that I interviewed described it, a creative sewer. And he called it a sewer because it provided employment to and exploited very talented illustrators, writers, and editors who were unable to find work in more legitimate or established publishing fields for a variety of reasons. The publishing industry was centered in New York, and at that time, there were certainly many restrictions on queer people, Jewish Americans, Black Americans, Asian Americans, and of course, women who were kept out of what were called the slick magazines, things like Life or the Saturday Evening Post that were printed on slick paper, which is how they got their name. And these people were essentially forced by the realities of American culture and economics to work in the comic book industry. So what comic books offer is not just a window into what was popular in the United States at a certain time, or reflections of political fears at a certain time. They offer us a means of listening to voices that are so often pushed to the margins in history, and particularly in American history. We are talking about artwork created by Black Americans, women, Jewish Americans, Asian Americans, other people pushed to the perimeters of society. And their work was bold and creative and very dangerous. And there was a great deal of it. For example, during the 1940s through 1954, there were about 1 billion comic books sold every year, not just in the United States, but around the world, 1 billion American comic books. That dwarfs the circulation numbers of any magazine you can name from that period. We are talking about an absolute torrent of culture produced by people who were rendered invisible at the time. And what we get to do is resuscitate their stories by looking at comic books. We get to highlight the importance of cultural, political, racial, and religious outsiders. And to me, that is absolutely invaluable And it is such a potent factor to combine with the study of US foreign relations, which is so often top down. What comics allow us to do is to study foreign relations and diplomacy simultaneously from the top down and the bottom up. And I can't think of too many other forms of media that permit that. Primarily because most other popular media at the time was heavily censored. There was a production code in Hollywood. There were obvious restrictions on advertising and content on radio, quite severe restrictions. The mainstream publishing industry was quite careful not to offend any of its consumers with risque content. And in contrast, the comic book industry was allowed to run wild. And it was allowed to run wild from the mid-30s through the end of 1954. So it's not just that we're getting the views and fears and hopes and dreams of people pushed to America's margins when we read old comic books. It's that we're also getting them unfiltered. And that to me is a priceless academic resource and a real reason to push forward with the study of comic books. So that's the background of the cultural form itself around mid-century. So now we turn to the title of my topic, which is the Pulp Empire. And I think it's best to address what that is and why I titled the book that way and why I think it encompasses this combination of US foreign relations, race, capitalism, and gender. I love the title of this conference, The American Mission. To me, what was that mission? That mission was the construction of a pulp empire. And at the core of a pulp empire, as I envision it, is the idea that comic books were inseparable from the politics and physical machinery of World War II and the Cold War. That means they were deployed and constrained by the United States as the government saw fit for the purposes of winning the great 20th century battles against totalitarianism, at first Nazism and second communism. The pulp empire is an acknowledgement that comic books were a real factor in waging and winning World War II and the Cold War. And within this empire, this pulp empire, comic books were inseparable from the issue of race, both at home and abroad. During World War II, the US paradoxically used comic books both to engender a race-based hatred of America's opponents, and at the same time to nourish racial tolerance on the home front, particularly towards Black Americans and towards America's allies, such as China and the Philippines. Race from the outset, as we will see, cannot be separated from comics. And then during the Cold War, using a slightly different technique, the US again tackles the topic of winning hearts and minds around the world using comics. And the main battleground where these comics are deployed by the tens and then hundreds of millions is the decolonizing world. And they're deployed in the decolonizing world for one simple reason that reverberates box after box of documents, reinforcing this idea that within the minds of American politicians and propagandists, there was universal agreement that non-white peoples were insufficiently sophisticated to understand, quote unquote, normal propaganda. They were thought so unsophisticated, so uneducated, that the only way to communicate clearly with them was to use what American propagandists and policymakers viewed as a very primitive medium, and that's comics. So for the rest of this talk, for the rest of our conversation afterwards, just remember that every decision we're talking about is driven by race. And the origins of this cooperation begin in 1943. And they begin with a quasi-governmental organization, as Joe pointed out, called the Writers' War Board. And the records of the board are at the Library of Congress. And I still very clearly remember the day that I stumbled across them. I shouted really loudly, was told to be quiet, and then got up from my seat at the big research tables in the Library of Congress and did laps for about 5 minutes because I was so excited to find these records. Basically, the Writers' War Board was created by Franklin Roosevelt under the auspices of the Office of War Information. And it was created for a very specific reason. Fascist governments, the governments of Japan and Italy and Germany, were known at the time for producing obviously state-sponsored propaganda. And Roosevelt, I believe, correctly understood that having propaganda come from above, come from the federal apparatus, would immediately prejudice people against the messages within it. So he pressed the Office of War Information to come up with an alternative. And what they developed became the Writers' War Board. The Writers' War Board, on paper, had no relationship to the federal government. Of course, secretly, behind the scenes, it received all of its funding from the Office of War Information, but that was not made public. And even more important, the staff of the Office of War Information was scrupulously vetted to make sure that none of the participants had any relationship with the US government. Instead, they were popular authors and illustrators. Rex Stout, who created the popular Nero Wolfe series of detective stories, you may have heard of him. He was the head of the Writers' War Board, and everyone who worked beneath him was also a writer or an artist. And what the Writers' War Board did was promote itself as a volunteer organization that was so patriotic, so pro-American, so anti-fascist, that all of these wealthy writers and illustrators were happy to give their time to furthering the American war effort and winning hearts and minds. And one of the first things they do in 1943 is send out a questionnaire to every major comic book publisher. And I want to stress that that's one of the first things that they do. So even these New York elite cultural producers from the outset understand the power of the comic book. And they do this for a few reasons. The first is, of course, that comics are cheap. They cost 10 cents at the newsstand. They cost vastly less to make. They're printed on awful paper. They're printed with 4 cheap colors of ink. And they are quite literally made to be consumed. When we talk about consumer cultures, comics are unique in that they were so shabbily put together, so cheaply made, that to read them was quite literally to consume them. They would fall apart eventually. And that was not considered a problem. So the first thing that attracts the War Board to comics is their cheapness. The second is their popularity. And I want to pause here for a moment because the general understanding of comic books now in the 21st century is that they are media for kids. And that you have to go to some kind of specialty store to buy them. They are the preserve of hobbyists and collectors and investors. But in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, the exact opposite was the case. Comic books were ubiquitous. Again, 1 billion of them a year are being churned out. This is a cultural torrent, a wave of culture. You could find them in the dentist's office. You could find them left on subway seats. You could find them in public buses. You could buy them at almost any sort of store, supermarkets, general stores. You could read them in schools. I came across numerous school librarians who stocked comic books out of the grudging admission that they could not get their students to read anything else. So we are talking about a society basically inundated with comics. And significantly, Market research studies from the time make it clear that it is not just kids reading these comics. It is men and women from diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds who are reading comics at least into their 40s. So what the Writers' War Board realizes very quickly is this is a way to get messages not just to kids on the home front, but to soldiers themselves in the service. And that to them is essential. They now have a cheap form of communication that can reach virtually everyone who is involved with both fighting or supporting troops behind the lines. The third reason they land on comic books is that there is an unshakable faith among propagandists in the United States that comics are perfectly understandable, that an illiterate 17-year-old who enlists somewhere in the United States and goes to boot camp, even though they can't read, they will be able to absorb the message contained in comics through the pictures. And if they have a basic reading level, they will be able to absorb whatever is written in comic books. For this reason, comic books are used to train soldiers on a variety of technical equipment during the war. But for the purposes of the Writers' War Board, this makes comics a remarkable propaganda tool because they are cheap, they are popular, and they are universally comprehensible. And the fourth and final reason that the Writers' War Board lands on comics is the most fascinating to me. It's because comic books are trash. The staff at the board looks at comic books and says, we can put whatever we want in these, and no one will ever suspect that the Writers' War Board or the federal government had anything to do with it because this medium is garbage. No one will ever think that highbrow politicians, that well-paid propagandists with degrees from all across the Ivy League are involved with the content of comic books. Their very shabbiness provides the perfect camouflage. And I'll show you something that that really struck the people at the Writers' War Board. This is an ad from a comic that ran in the late 40s, but this was a very typical comic book ad that you could have found in most any issue from the early 40s through the mid 50s. And at first glance, it looks like it's a soothing massager. If you look a little more carefully, you realize that it's in fact an ad for a sex toy, for a vibrator. And the propagandists at the Writers' War Board looked at these things, and once they got over their initial revulsion, they realized this was flawless camouflage for whatever message they wanted to put into comics. They were so energized by this that they reached out to all of the major publishers. And intriguingly, I found evidence that every publisher got back to the Writers' War Board. They answered the questionnaires sent out by the Writers' War Board, with one exception. Marvel Comics, which was then known as Timely, does not seem to have responded to any inquiries from 1943 through 1945 from the Office of War Information or the Writers' War Board or the Office for Inter-American Affairs or any of the other agencies that used comics. And to me, that's fascinating. I have to get to the bottom of why Marvel was so disinterested. But all of the other major publishers get back to the board and they affirm what the board thinks, which is that a huge proportion of their readers are men aged 15 to 25, that they write with the most basic English language possible to reach the widest possible audience, and that they are happy to cooperate with the government. And there's a couple of specific reasons why they are so happy to cooperate with the government. The first is obviously these publishers want to appear patriotic. But the second and more American and certainly more capitalist reason is that wood pulp, which is the basis of comic book paper, is a heavily rationed resource during World War II. And if comic book publishers want access to that wood pulp, and they do, because they are selling millions of comics a month, they have to play ball. So again, all of the major publishers except Marvel cheerfully agree to join in this propaganda project that the Writers' War Board is putting together. There's an aspect to the Writers' War Board's relationship with comics that I already touched on, and for me it is perhaps one of the most fascinating aspects of the research I did for Pulp Empire. It's that during World War II, the Writers' War Board used comic books simultaneously for two seemingly incompatible goals. The board initially started out asking publishers to help create stories with the assistance of editors and writers at the board that turned America's opponents into villains. And very quickly, the board realizes the easiest way to do that is through race. The Japanese, in particular, are demonized through race-based propaganda, but Germans are as well. And the first thing that the Writers' War Board realizes, to its horror, when it examines comics on the newsstands, is that there's a distinction drawn between Nazis and Germans. And the board loses its mind and tells comic book publishers, you cannot draw this distinction. There is no such thing as a good German. There is no such thing as a good Nazi. You must conflate Germans and Nazis. And one of the first products of this cooperation between the board and the industry is this, All-Star Comics number 24, which comes out in 1944. And it is a 64-page comic, all of which is devoted to a single story called This Is Our Enemy, as you can see on the title. And this typifies the ways that Germans were vilified through race. Basically, This Is Our Enemy is a look through the past 1,000 years of Germanic history. And the conclusion that the Justice Society of America comes to after looking at all this history is that there is something inherently wrong with the German psyche. There is something deeply flawed and psychotic about Germans, and that there is no reasoning with them. The only way to deal with Germans is to embrace a war of extermination against them. And this was fascinating for me to discover, because there is total agreement between the Office of War Information, the Writers' War Board, the US Armed Services, basically everyone involved with prosecuting the war against Germany, that it must be a war of extermination. It must be an ethnic cleansing, and that it is okay, in fact, it is laudable for American soldiers, servicemen, servicewomen, to try and exterminate Germany as a people and as a country, and that the post-war peace relies upon this, that it's not only not bad to take a totally homicidal approach towards the German enemy, but it is in fact necessary to do so to ensure world peace. Something similar is done against America's Japanese opponents. Publishers are encouraged to treat Japanese characters as subhuman. There is a trend before the Writers' War Board gets involved in the comic book industry to create Asian supervillains, such as the Claw, who we can see here. The Claw is obviously a horrific representation of an Asian character. And the Claw in his own comics and in Silver Streak comics is almost a god. He can make himself the size of mountains. He can call upon vast hordes of Asians to invade the United States, to topple US society. And the board sees things like this and tells the publisher, the racist part is fine, but we can't have any more representations of Japanese characters as godlike or as more powerful than American soldiers. We would like you instead to focus on animalizing Japanese characters, treating them as less than. And they make one qualification to that, which is, please animalize them, please treat them as eminently beatable foes, but also reinforce for American readers that because Japanese characters and soldiers are somehow less than human, they are very dogged opponents, and that this is going to be a very long war indeed. So we want Americans to look down upon their Japanese opponents, but we do not want Americans to dismiss their Japanese opponents. We need to prepare American service members and people on the home front for a very long war of racial extermination. And that is the first aspect that the Writers' War Board brings to wartime comic book propaganda. But at the same time, they are using race-based propaganda to do the exact opposite of what we have just discussed. They ask comic book publishers to start creating stories with positive representations of Black American characters, positive representations of Chinese characters, of Filipino characters. And we can see, here is, unfortunately, a fairly average depiction of a Japanese opponent. And when companies were asked to do something different with their representations of America's allies, they came up with things like this. The mournfully named Filipinos Are People. So that title makes me sad every time I read it. The idea that the American public has to be taught that Filipinos are in fact human is a horrifying one. But this is what the board requested, and publishers complied. The goal was to highlight the contributions of America's allies. And at the same time, the board is asked to the board asks publishers to improve their representations of Black Americans. And here, from an issue of Wonder Woman in 1945, we have the history of Sojourner Truth, the great civil rights activist and anti-slavery activist. And what's interesting about this story is that the board demanded that it be produced, but only for very cynical and pragmatic reasons. The board told the publisher, in this case DC, that what they wanted was a positive story, but they could not publish anything that would outrage any American Southerners or any racist American service members. This had to be a story that promoted Sojourner Truth without agitating the pervasive racism of Americans at the time. And the reasoning that they gave for this was the purpose of this story was basically to stop race riots from impeding the war effort or for impeding wartime production at factories. It was not idealism. It was not to cure the United States of racism. It was not to make a more tolerant society. It was purely to streamline the war effort and make sure that the United States did not look bad in front of the rest of the world because it had frequent race riots or strife at defense factories. And as a result, what happens is a very odd series of stories like this one in which Black American characters almost never share panel space with white American characters. Stories that are full of racial slurs because to white Americans at the time, those were not considered offensive. Here is another story from 1945 that involves the Tuskegee Airmen, the legendary Red Tails, the Black American squadron of pilots that is organized during the war. And what we see here is panels in which it's overwhelmingly white characters or Black characters by themselves. They do not mingle and they do not mix. And the comic itself is based on a lie. The comic is based on the idea that these Black American pilots are so selfless that they volunteer to give blood to this Nazi in the final panel. Whereas in reality, during World War II, Black Americans were not even permitted to give blood or plasma to white American soldiers. Blood was segregated, again, in an effort to not antagonize racist Americans, particularly Southern American politicians. So what the board is trying to do here is walk a tightrope. They are trying to keep racial tensions calm on the home front. At the same time, they are trying to build deep, vicious, race-based hatred of Americans' opponents. And it's difficult to evaluate the success of this program, but it was not the last time that American comic book propagandists would try to walk this tightrope. I'm going to touch very briefly on a comic book produced during World War II by a separate agency, which was the Office for Inter-American Affairs, which was basically concerned with generating goodwill between North Americans and South Americans. And what they did was they produced free propaganda comics, such as this one, The United States in the War, for distribution throughout the global South. And these comics were free, and they were produced on site throughout the global South. They were not commercial comic books. They starred no recognizable comic book superheroes or characters. And they were produced on the cheap wherever they needed to be distributed. This is significant because in 1945, the US government relinquishes all of its control over the comic book industry. It simply walks away. It has turned the comic book industry into a colossus. It has distributed perhaps 500 million comic books across US Army bases and military bases around the world during the war. It has fueled the domestic comic book industry by giving it access to wood pulp. It has exerted massive control over the contents of wartime comic books through the Writers' War Board and other agencies. And at a stroke, with the end of the war, all of this control is relinquished. Very quickly, US propagandists and policymakers realize that this is a mistake. And what they do is take the lessons learned from this propaganda comic we see right here, The United States in the War, and apply it to the new forming Cold War. And I understand that I'm coming up on my time, so I will make this quick. But basically what happens after the war on the commercial side is that superheroes disappear almost overnight. By 1948, the only superheroes left really are Wonder Woman, Superman, Batman, occasionally Captain America. What has taken their place is a stream of increasingly lurid crime, horror, and romance themed comic books. And the creator of these new disturbing genres were two men, Lev Gleason, a publisher, and his main artist, Charles Biro. And you can see they actually have their names here on the cover, which is rare for a comic book. Crime Does Not Pay was a four-color nightmare. I don't know how else to describe it. It offends 21st century sensibilities, let alone mid-20th century sensibilities. And as an example here, I pulled this cover at random, but what's happening on this cover is a bunch of men in a car, one of whom is carrying a rope, presumably to either bind someone or strangle them. And one of their members has gotten out of the car and is luring this young girl into the car with an ice cream cone. And the implication is both obvious and horrifying. This is what sold after World War II. This is another popular title, Underworld Crime. And we see here this woman being menaced by a red hot phallus, which is either going to be forced into her mouth or to burn her face. Really unnerving stuff. We see here Crimed by Women, which is one of the most interesting post-war crime comics to me, because it turns the idea of white American womanhood on its head. It turns white American women into violent, very sexual criminals, as do many of the other post-war comic books. And Because all of these publishers are now free from government control, they are free to cater to the tastes globally of people who have been absolutely emotionally shattered by World War II. Whereas in the early 1940s or late 1930s, superheroes appealed to a global audience, to people numbed and horrified by the revelations of the atomic bombings, of Nazi death camps, of the Bataan Death March, of the fact that the United States, the supposed vanguard of democracy, has waged a war of extermination against multiple enemies. They are no longer interested in sort of cheesy superhero comic titles anymore. They're looking for much grittier, much more violent and sexualized fare. And because the government has checked out of the comic book industry, publishers are able to provide it. Because again, there is no censorship of comic books at this point. And sales begin to skyrocket. Crime Does Not Pay is publishing anywhere between 1 and 10 million copies a month, depending. Underworld crime is hugely popular. Crimes by Women is extremely popular. Other titles like this, Fight Against Crime, where you can see this full-figured woman who has had her head cut off and is being stuffed down a manhole, a popular title. And here, a rather significant title called The Killers, on which we see stereotypical Middle Eastern men in the act of killing people. And what happens very quickly as these comics get popular is that federal policymakers and propagandists realize they have made a horrible mistake. They have relinquished control of the comic book, and as a result, things like this are now being presented to a global audience. And I believe most of you in the crowd here have heard about Dr. Frederick Wertham and his campaign against comics, the Senate subcommittee investigation in 1954 that puts an end to this uncensored comic book industry. And all of the literature before the publication of Pulp Empire that dealt with this comics crusade and these Senate subcommittee hearings focused on the violence of post-war comics. Or the sexuality of things like romantic love, the violence of fight against crime. But if you actually go into the records of the Senate subcommittee and see what they sent to comic book publishers and see who they interviewed, there is a deep, deep fear that comics like this are the problem, that by showing a global audience, comics are globally popular, racism on this scale, racism on this scale, that the United States is losing any hope of winning hearts and minds in the decolonizing world. This is a major concern for policymakers and propagandists. And I myself was not aware of that until I spent a few months going through congressional records of these hearings and going through Frederick Wertham's papers at the Library of Congress. It's worth noting that it is Wertham who notifies the government of this problem. Wertham alone, of all of the post-war comic book critics, is the man who realizes that racism like this is going to make victory in the Cold War impossible. That as long as audiences of color are exposed to things like Thunder, King of the Congo, or any of the other comic books that I've shown so far, they are not going to trust the United States. They are not going to believe that the United States offers a more equitable and fair alternative to Soviet-style communism. And he sounds the alarm. And it's very easy to villainize Wertham, generations of writers have. But I want to stress that for all of his faults, for all of his shortcomings, for all of his titanic failures to conduct himself ethically or scientifically, Wertham alone is the analyst that warns the US government that the racist content of post-war uncensored comics is going to doom the United States in its battle against Soviet-style communism. And the US Senate takes note of that and works very hard behind the scenes with Wertham to censor the US comic book industry. And in fact, they succeed. And by the early 1955, the uncensored American comic book industry is no more. But as soon as the American government is finished crushing the commercial comic book industry, propagandists go back to this very comic and realize we may have had to quash commercial comic books, but propaganda comic books in the style of this one can be immensely helpful. And they get together with a company called Commercial Comics, run by a man named Malcolm Ader. Here are a couple of his early publications. And they task Commercial Comics with creating pro-tolerance, pro-American, and anti-communist comic books for distribution throughout the world. And they use the same methodology as this earlier comic book produced by the Office for Inter-American Affairs. They print comics in a variety of languages. They print them on site rather than in the United States. If the comic is intended for distribution in Brazil, it's printed in Brazil to keep expenses down. And they are all produced and distributed on the same basis that comics are during World War II, which is that people of color simply aren't mentally equipped to understand more conventional propaganda, and that the only way to reach them is through comic books. And it's not just the State Department or the post-war successors to the Writers' War Board that use these comic books. I want to draw your attention here to what I consider a crime comic book. This is from a CIA murder manual that was distributed during the successful effort to overthrow the democratically elected government of Guatemala. And what this is called is the conference room technique, as you can see here at the top. And basically what this is a diagram in comic book form published by the CIA, teaching Guatemalan right-wingers how to kill left-wingers and then make their murders look like an accident. So when we talk about Cold War comic book propaganda, it's important to stress that it is not simply benign organizations or better known, more visible organizations like the State Department that's using them. It is every facet of the federal government, up to and including all of the intelligence agencies at the time. This is an early example. Within a few years, the United States is airdropping tens of millions of comic books over Cuba to try and overthrow Castro. Comic books are seen as absolutely vital to winning the Cold War in the global South. At the same time, the government goes to extreme efforts to make sure that populations in Western Europe, white populations, have no opportunity to see comics like these because they understand, or at the very least fear, that the United States will not be taken seriously as a cultural producer if these comic books become public. And it's a really interesting concern, and it feeds into why the United States publicized modern art and modern dance and jazz and all sorts of highbrow art during the Cold War. It was to, of course, win hearts and minds and show that the United States was sophisticated, also to draw attention away from comic books like The Free World Speaks or this murder manual, or commercial comic books like T-Man, which is one of the most outrageous titles I came across in my research. Here he is beating up a bunch of Iranians. Here he's calling an Iranian a raghead and throwing a pig at him, which, as you can read here, the insult beyond all insults to a Muslim. Here in another issue of T-Man, he's calling an Iranian fatty. It is to distract from all of these sorts of commercial and propaganda comics that the United States emphasizes high culture in Western Europe and tries to keep things like this away from Western European audiences. So again, there is a very fascinating duality to the way that the United States both appropriates and chokes off the comic book industry during the Cold War, much as the Writers' War Board simultaneously tried to use comics to promote racial harmony and race-based hatred during World War II. This is a very complex dance that the government is engaged in. And I understand that I've been speaking for a long time, and I want to get to questions and conversations. So I'm simply going to reiterate once more that all of what we've seen here, all of these comics, their creation, their contents, their appearance, their distribution, all of these are shaped by the issue, the question of race. Race at home, race abroad, and America's ability to win non-white allies in its fights against totalitarianism. And to wrap up, I simply want to ask you to think about what is left to learn. My book ends in 1965. So what happens after that? Is the US government still using comics to these ends? How has the overwhelming success of Marvel movies affected America's use of comic book propaganda? Is the US government involved with shaping and producing these Marvel movies? What is left for us to understand? And of course, the answers to that are numerous, and I hope we get to discuss them. But more important than that, to bring this back to the beginning, I hope we get to solve these questions together. I hope we get to tackle them together. Everyone listening to this talk right now, everyone about to participate in the conversation is at the forefront of a small and growing discipline. And again, I'm just so happy to be here talking to you about it, to be here at this beginning, at the spark. And with that, I will cease speaking and look forward to hearing from all of you.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Hopefully you can hear me. I'm here in the room.
I can.
Okay, good. With some of the other panelists, why don't we go ahead and open it up to questions? I think we already have two that were asked on the chat. If you want to take a glance at those.
Oh, sure.
And we can have anyone else who's interested in asking questions either here or online, go ahead and do so.
This first, let's see, question from Hal Friedman. Don't America? Absolutely right. What Mr. Friedman or Dr. Friedman is asking here is whether policymakers also believe that working class white Americans are as unsophisticated as audiences of color around the world, and that wouldn't their perceived lack of sophistication also drive the government to feed comic books to soldiers during World War II and the working class on the home front? And the answer is absolutely yes. He's quite right. Social class is a factor in decision making as well as race. I guess the distinction I would draw is that there is a faith on the part of US propagandists that less educated Americans are already reading comic books, and that their job as propagandists and policymakers is to reach audiences that might not already have had as much access to comic books as the less educated at home. Hence the outreach to older members of the armed forces, outreach to fairly sophisticated communities of non-white peoples around the world. And that's the distinction I would draw, but I almost don't need to draw that distinction. The short answer to Hal Friedman's question is, yes, you're right. Let me see if there's another question here. How much does the pressure of communist propaganda have a role in determining American politicians to address racism? That is a great question. Lavinia, thank you for asking that. It's a huge part of why the United States uses comic books as it does during the Cold War. So again, I mentioned the Senate subcommittee hearings in 1954 that ultimately lead to the end of the uncensored comic book industry in the United States. The comic book crusade spearheaded by Dr. Frederick Wertham that results in the neutering of the American comic book. The traditional narrative, as I mentioned for this, has been, it was the violence and fear of the violence in comic books and the fear that that violence would cause juvenile delinquency that led the US government and activists like Wortham to call for an end to the uncensored comic book. But if you do a closer reading of the records of that Senate subcommittee, if you do closer readings of the Office for Inter-American Affairs documents, the records of the State Department, the records of all of the Cold War era international agencies that spring up in an effort to win hearts and minds, you will see that they are horrified by comic books for one very important reason that Lavinia has touched on. It's that this torrent of uncensored comic books provides a limitless fountain of evidence for communist propagandists who are out to prove that the United States is a depraved society, that the United States is obsessed with violence, and sex, and money, and that the United States, for all of its flowery talk of equality and tolerance, is in fact a brutal, unforgiving, and deeply racist society. And the senators involved with the subcommittee investigating comics, as well as propagandists at the time, are horrified that the US commercial comic book industry is basically a limitless resource for these propagandists. So yes, Lavinia, thank you for bringing that up, and you're quite right. And that was one of the things that excited me the most about writing this book, was realizing just how much US foreign relations and perceptions of the United States abroad factored into the government's relationship to the comic book industry during the Cold War. Let's see, are there any others here? I don't see any other questions. Please shoot if you have them.
Well, I'll go ahead and ask a question. I'd be interested, after the hearings happened, I mean, how did comics deal with the Cold War? Did they kind of revert back to the kind of World War II rah-rah around the government, or did they have a more complex interaction as they kind of did before the war board got involved and kind of steering them in the direction?
So, first of all, thank you for asking that. I think the answer to that question is vital for a couple of reasons, not just because we need to know it, but because it also ties to the present and to the current tidal wave of Marvel movies that are taking over the world. What happens after the government neuters the comic book industry is that almost overnight, the majority of comic book publishers exit the business. They lock the doors and walk away. One of the few survivors is Marvel, then known as Timely. And Marvel is rebooting itself in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And I haven't been permitted to look at their internal records, but it seems to me that what Marvel realizes, it's not complicated, is that if they continue to publish crime and horror comic books that run afoul of the United States, that they are going to get the hammer dropped on them by the next Senate subcommittee or the next organization that decides comics are a problem. So what Marvel seems to do, as best as I can tell, is they take the lesson of the anti-comic book crusade, internalize it, and say, the way we can survive is by becoming vehemently pro-American, rather than attacking the US commitment to the Cold War, rather than presenting America's Cold War allies as primitives, rather than creating apocalyptic stories about the atomic bomb, which was a very popular subgenre. We are going to toe the line. And one of the first characters they demonstrate that with is Iron Man. Iron Man is basically the US military industrial complex personified, made human. I mean, he is a living weapon that exists to fight communism. He is an uber capitalist who is happy to go to Vietnam and teach American soldiers there how to kill Viet Cong. And I should add that it's not just Iron Man who publicly engages on the side of the United States in the Cold War in Marvel Comics. There's an amazing issue of Journey into Mystery where Thor, a god, goes to Vietnam and decides he's going to help the South Vietnamese win. There are numerous issues of Fantastic Four where they get involved in the Cold War. And so I think the answer to your question is that Marvel reads the room really well. And they realize that this confrontational, adversarial kind of style that the comic book industry has thrived on since the late 30s, it can't continue. The government will not put up with it. And if they want to stay in business, they have to join the Cold War consensus. And I think it's really important for us to start researching and writing about this, because that reality is inseparable from the characters we see on movie screens now. You know, a lot of the Marvel heroes that are in movies now were created to fight the Cold War, and they were created to fight the Cold War in a completely unambiguously pro-American style. And you know, we can't understand these current movies until we go back and really work through why Marvel made the decisions it did and why it decided to become so vehemently pro-American. I've given you my hypothesis, but I would love to get into their archives and know for sure.
Hi, Paul, could I jump in with just a real quick question? I thought
Sure.
I'm a huge fan of the book, and that was a great presentation. I'm fascinated by Marvel's silence. And you, I think, just now covered really brilliantly a speculation, I know, but it sounds right to me, kind of how Marvel got to where Marvel would be afterwards. And I think we kind of know there's at least, you know, military involvement in a lot of the current MCU movies. So
Yes.
We can assume that involvement goes deeper than that. But I'm surprised by Goodman's lack of interest in playing ball, given that, as you said, wood pulp was one of the major driving forces. That was the real kind of carrot and stick that was driving folks to participate. Goodman owned his own distributor, but he didn't own, like, he had no ready access to wood pulp that I know of. Do you have any kind of guesses? I know guesses are risky.
No, I have a guess.
Okay, good.
First of all, thank you for asking that question. That's a great, we need to answer that question comprehensively. So thank you for bringing it up. I'll do my best. I think, and for those of you that aren't familiar, Martin Goodman is the head of Timely Comics. And the question is, you know, why didn't Goodman choose to participate and cooperate with the government when he had the opportunity? The answer I can come up with is fairly basic, which is that comic book publishers during World War II were selling over 100%. And I didn't understand what that meant for a while until I dove a little deeper into the bottom end of the publishing industry in the United States at that time. But basically there was something called spoilage, which was, you know, if you printed 100 copies of a comic book or a magazine, 10 of them might come off the press all wrinkled and damaged, and you didn't really want to sell the spoiled issues. But comic books were so popular during World War II that they sold the spoilage. So they were selling more than 100% basically of what was intended for sale on the newsstands. And my suspicion is that Goodman, who, you know, had the reputation of being a very sort of cutthroat business person and, you know, not terribly interested in comic books as art, felt he was selling everything he could make anyway. So who cared? You know, who wanted to be involved with these troublemakers that might ask him to change the contents of his comic books? You know, that's my strong feeling, and that, you know, as other people gain primacy at Marvel after World War II, it is their more nuanced view of the world and the need to play ball that overwhelms Goodman's previous prejudices.
That sounds great. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd love to talk some more if anyone has any questions.
Oh, we got one question in the chat there. Why did you start studying comic books? And
yeah, okay. So I don't, Andrea, I don't know if you've read the book, or Dr. Nadolny, or I'm sorry, I don't know your nomenclature. But I love this question. And in case you haven't read Pulp Empire, the very beginning of the intro is a very quick story about when I was about 10 and I was a fairly serious comic geek, I had to walk to this very shady comic book store, probably a mile and a half from my home in New York. And the guy who ran it was so dodgy. And I asked him if he would hire me as an assistant in his shop one day. When I couldn't have been older than 10. And this guy always had a briefcase on the counter in his store. And when I asked him if he would hire me, he opened the briefcase and pulled out a chromed revolver and said, oh, I already have all the help I need. Tell your friends. And I was like simultaneously horrified and excited and like wanted to tell everyone and wanted to keep it a secret. Like, this man pulled a gun on me. And it kind of typified comics to me as a kid. They were about funk and good, like weird smells in that comic book shop, and the terror of him pulling that gun on me, and excitement. But, you know, I got to be 12 and 13 and whatever, and I lost interest. And then I went back to graduate school through the National Science Foundation after 9/11, because they were funding anyone who was willing to study nuclear weapons proliferation. And I was happy to do that. And I did so. And after a couple of years of studying the spread of nuclear weapons, I could no longer sleep at night. I was crying a lot. I had basically given up on life because I felt like we were all on borrowed time, and it was just a matter of years before the world was, you know, fractured with any number of hydrogen bomb explosions. And I realized I had to make a change. And I realized that when I was doing a research trip in Washington, D.C., and I was going through Richard Nixon's records, and there was a reference in one of them to a program that began under JFK called Operation Mongoose. And Operation Mongoose was a joint project between the CIA and a number of other organizations. And it was an effort to overthrow Castro. And a big part of Operation Mongoose was, as I mentioned, airdropping these tens of millions of comic books over Cuba to try and convince Cubans to revolt. And if you can still see my screen here, this is one of them. So you can see right up here at the top, in this batch of comics that were printed, they printed 87,000 copies of this. El Despertar was written in the early 50s, and we can see up here, there's a date of 1967 on it. So 10 years after it was written, they were still printing, you know, 87,000 copies at a time to dump over Cuba. This is a really serious part of Operation Mongoose and later efforts to overthrow Castro. And I saw a reference to Operation Mongoose and these comic books being airdropped, and it was like, you know, every bell in the universe went off. It's like, I'm not reading about nuclear weapons anymore. I'm studying this. If Richard Nixon was involved in dumping comic books over communist countries, then I have to know about that. And I may not have read a comic book in 20 years, but I am getting back into it right now.
All right, well, let's go ahead and close with the idea and the image of a small comic book floating down on a parachute into Cuba, because I think that's just fantastic. But thank you so much, Paul, for speaking with us tonight. Thank you, everyone who was here. And we hope that we'll see some of you either virtually or in person tomorrow. So thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. I look forward to meeting all of you. As contact me through my website, however you'd like, and I look forward to talking with you tomorrow too.
All right, virtual round of applause. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, have a good